everyone. Welcome to our Journal of Supply Chain Management Climate Change webinar. My name is Dave Peter. I'm a professor of supply chain management at Iowa State University. I'd like to welcome everyone for joining us today. Before we begin the formal part of our webinar, I'd just like to provide some opening comments. So let me share my screen with you. As we conduct today's webinar, if you have any comments that you would like to share, please post them into the Zoom chat box. And either I or Mark will receive those comments, and then Mark will ask questions as time permits to our panelists today. So to begin, I just want to remind everybody that this is the third of our 3 webinars that we've held on this topic. We began our first webinar on February 24th, discussing why climate change is an important topic to supply chain scholars. We had several panelists with us, including Anders Lieberman, Andreas Wieland, Michael Gerst, and Laharesh Guntika, and I had moderated that session, and they had talked about why climate change is important from a climate science perspective. We also linked it to the supply chain discipline and talked about some research that's being conducted in this area. And that was mainly discussed by Michael and Laharesh in terms of the research that they're conducting from a supply chain perspective. And Andreas as well shared some of his research during that February 24th webinar. On March 3rd, we talked about the motivation behind climate change research from a supply chain perspective with Anne and Lucy. That session was moderated by Craig Carter. And then today we have with us Lee Matthews, who's going to talk about how to conduct research on this topic. And the session will be moderated by Mark Pagel. Just to remind you, we did conduct a survey at the end of the first webinar, and several of you had posted comments on a wide range of issues, ranging from people and the social elements to the impact on the planet. We also talked about or had some comments on innovation and how innovation can help us tackle climate change. Some of the comments were on the psychology side, and then some of you expressed feedback from a supply chain systems and structures perspective. Then we also had a question as to what are some research methods and data sources scholars should use to conduct research on this topic. And what I have listed here on the screen are some of the research methods and data sources that were shared with us. Many of the comments related to case study research. Several of you believe that we need to do some exploratory research on this topic. So that's what I wanted to do, is just sum up where we've been. And now what I'd like to do is have Lee and Mark lead us on the research methods and data sources topic.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. Because there are just 2 of us, while I am officially the moderator, Lee and I decided that I would do the introduction today to try and frame how we're going about this. And then Lee's going to do the heart of the presentation, and I'll come back in at the conclusion. And we're aiming to be done with plenty of time for question and answer at the end. And we're also willing, if there's a good conversation going on, to stay for a little bit after. And finally, I should note that we believe that we are all going to use the same screen, but this is our first time playing with the new Zoom feature. So if it goes horribly wrong, you'll hear much cursing, and then we'll fix it, which might start right now. Okay, so our remit, what we were asked to do was to focus on the how. How can supply chain scholars move forward from a research methods and data sources perspective? And as we worked through this process, so initial meetings with presenters across all 3 of the webinars, and then meetings between Lee and I, there were a few things that became really important that we needed to make sure that we addressed in our time with you. One was that there was a concern from the beginning that the webinars did not turn out to be one of those events where you went and you said, well, that was really inspiring, and you left with a warm, fuzzy feeling. And then half an hour later, you went, oh crap, what do I do with this? In other words, we had to make sure that we remembered our good MBA teaching and left you with takeaways, or left the discipline with takeaways, things that we could do. And then as we started building on that, and especially looking at the feedback from the first two sessions, there were some other issues that came up that we wanted to make sure we dealt with. And one of them, so we really appreciate the feedback from the first two sessions, but one of the things that surprised us, and I'm going to try and be polite here, there are enough of you in the audience who know me, who know how difficult that can be for me. But we were surprised that a lot of the feedback, while good, was also not necessarily new. And that was true about the content as well, right? So I think we collectively, as a discipline, we know there's a problem. And really, I shouldn't have chosen the word problem for this slide, right? It's more than a problem, it's an emergency. In addition, I think that we know that we're going to have to collaborate with both natural scientists and social scientists. And building on that, I think we also know that a lot of the hard science solutions are known. They may not be known at scale, but we know kind of what we need to do, and that the real issue is not so much the hard science per se, but it's getting people and the organizations in which people work to actually make the changes. And so we really need that, and that's why we need that collaboration between natural scientists and social scientists. And I would argue that we in the supply chain realm should be especially well suited to that. Not only are these typically supply chain problems that need to be solved, but if you think about our discipline, it's always kind of straddled both of those spheres, right? That we have a lot of engineering, laws of thermodynamics type roots on the one side, while simultaneously there's also a great deal of organizational behavior, individual behavior, psychology, and so on. In other words, we should be good at straddling that natural sciences, social sciences divide. We should be good nexus collaborators for doing this. That said, I don't think that many of our theories and methods are fit for this purpose. And then finally, and probably the issue that we struggled the most with, is that the climate emergency is not an emerging discourse incubator topic, right? The Journal of Supply Chain Management, when we want to do a special issue, we tend to do these emerging discourse incubators. And the word emerging is important there, right? They're supposed to be topics that aren't currently on the radar, that people aren't necessarily working in yet. If this isn't on your radar, you haven't been paying attention for the last 25 to 30 years, right? We've been doing research in this space since the late 90s. I see people in the virtual room who, like me, have been doing this for 25 years, if not longer. But when we look at both practice and academia, I would suggest that we still treat it like this emerging area, right? We have a separate group for sustainability. We do special sessions. It's something we really do need to sort out into the future. And so we've got this conundrum where, on one hand, we're treating it like an emerging issue. On the other hand, we've known about it for 30 years. And so what was important for Lee and I, if we're going to be making suggestions that are actionable, we have to understand why it is that nothing's happened in the last 30 years. And nothing is probably unfair. And the first thing that came to me was this famous quote from Max, and usually Max is kind of quoted the pithy version on the left, right? Science advances one funeral at a time. And I am enough of a cynic that really resonates with me. But when you look at what Max really said, and when you look at the field, I don't think that's our solution, that's our problem, nor is it our solution, right? So what Max really said is that when there's a paradigm shift in a scientific field, that paradigm shift takes time because the people from the old paradigm have to move on. And as a senior scholar, I'm not going to say die, but they have to move on. And they're replaced by a new generation who grows up with the new paradigm. Well, if we've been doing this since the late 90s, we have at least one, if not two generations for whom this is the paradigm. The problem is not that this isn't something that there is a critical mass of people to do, or at least I don't think that's the fundamental problem. I think the fundamental problem is something else. And it's something that Anne and Lucy touched on last week, and it's something that Lee and I discovered we were potentially going to make the same mistake. And so one of the things that Anne and Lucy mentioned last week was a time paradox, where many of the things that we need to do as scholars to address these issues are going to take a lot of time. Yet the issue is urgent. And how do we bridge that divide? And when Lee and I were looking at the first draft of what we were planning to do, we realized that while we hoped that a lot of it would be very inspiring, that was our hope, we also saw that it had the potential to not actually get acted on. And rather than trying to explain that with lots of words, let me give you an example. So I keep on my desk, and this now it's a virtual desk, an article that I read relatively recently that I want to use as kind of inspiration, guidance, whatever, for the next big project I'm going to do. And so this thing sits in the middle of my virtual desk, and anytime I'm being philosophical or I've got a little bit of time to plan or whatever, I open it. And throughout my career, these articles have changed. The current article that's sitting on my desk is from the Journal of Industrial Ecology. And it is entitled, Why Academics Should Study the Supply Chains of Individual Organizations. Now, the implicit here is that these academics are industrial ecologists and or environmental scientists because they're the readers of this journal, right? And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to say, well, we could have a very similar type of article, Call to Arms in the Journal of Supply Chain Management, right? Why supply chain academics should study industrial ecology. But so that's, to me, that's my starting point. And then I look at this paragraph here, which is kind of the bit I keep going back to, right? That what would this look like? And they say it would look like combining approaches from industrial ecology with those from geography, sociology, and other social sciences. And I guess what are the other social sciences? Develop a political industrial ecology of supply chains. Now, I'm not sure I would use that phrase, Lee might, but I probably wouldn't. But the next sentence is the part that really resonates for me. That this both physically links the actual product flows, the supply chain that I study already, with their environmental impacts and explores how they affect justice, equity, and welfare. This is then a proposal for how to study sustainable supply chains. And every time I read this, I go, yeah, that's what I've been trying to do for the last 25 years. This is what I want to be doing. But, and it's a relatively big but, and this is our kind of fear/goal for the rest of the presentation. This article is from 2019, which means it was probably published in 2018. It's still sitting on my desk. It inspires, but it does not drive action. And then the question becomes why? And I think the why is that this is an awfully big leap. It's asking an awful lot. It's really difficult to envision how I go from where I am presently to this. And so what Lee and I want to make sure that we do for the next half hour is, A, we do want to leave you with takeaways, but we want to make sure that they're not inspirational ideas that don't get implemented because they're too daunting in their entirety. So while I am sure, and actually I do hope that Lee daunts you a little bit, it wouldn't be a good presentation if he didn't daunt you a bit. But we also believe that we've structured this thing so we're going to pull it back at the end. And at the last quarter of the presentation or so is going to be very much focused on, how do we get started today? How do we make sure that we can get to that endpoint relatively quickly while acknowledging that you're probably not going to start by jumping right in with the industrial ecologists and the sociologists and so on. So I'm going to hand it over to Lee now. What I'd like to note as we switch presenters is that as you watch, I'm going to be monitoring the chat. Dave's going to help me with that. And if you have comments about things that you think we've missed, If you have comments about things that you think are really important that we need to highlight, and especially if you have ideas about where there's a great deal of leverage, in other words, where we can make big changes with not necessarily huge efforts, right? That please flag those things, because that's where we want to sort of drive the discussion. So now I will turn you over to Lee, who will tell you how we're going to do this. Lee, you're muted.
Yes, okay, thank you. Can you hear me now? Sorry, I didn't have the option to unmute for some reason. So yeah, okay, the how question is a huge question. No bigger than the questions asked of the preceding presenters in the other webinars, but a huge question nonetheless, a daunting question to be asked, and possibly going to produce some daunting answers as part of that. So what I've tried to do in this part of the presentation is I've tried to take something that's very, very big and make it smaller somewhat. So what I've done is I've turned it into 3 challenges that I'd like to talk to you about today, and then 3 possible responses to those challenges. And this is painting pretty much with broad strokes, really. And where I think the value largely from our session will come is in how you see these challenges, how you see these responses, how you see alternatives to these perhaps as well. And that'll make for a great discussion later on. So the first challenge really, thinking back to webinar 1, is how do we produce scholarship that is more ecologically literate? So how do we start to talk the language of the scientists and make a meaningful contribution as they might see it towards averting this catastrophe? And then how do we capture the complexity of climate change within our scholarship? Not just complexity as an environmental problem, but complexity as a social problem, as Anne and Lucy talked about last week. And then as Mark talked about earlier on, how do we deal with this paradox where we have to engage in these large scale transformations, which would normally take a very long period of time, and how do we do that as urgently as required by the crisis itself? And then the 3 possible responses, and not the only ones, of course, but the 3 possible responses I'd like to talk about today are problematization, engaged scholarship, and collaboration. And then at the end, I'll try to take all of this and make it small enough for us to be able to act upon it. So the first challenge is to produce ecologically literate research. So this is where we're going to have to start speaking the language of the natural scientists. And some of us are doing this already by embracing the planetary boundaries framework that you can see on the right there. But the challenge here really is how do we start to link supply chain activities up to that much higher level of the planetary boundaries? And this is really going to require a paradigm shift from us. So paradigm is one of those words that's used a lot but rarely defined. But what I mean by it is really the accepted problems for us to work on, the accepted questions that we can ask, the legitimate ways of answering those questions, and then how the answers to those questions are evaluated within our community. And we really have to change all of that, really, if we're going to start producing ecologically literate research. So this really requires a shift from us, from thinking about efficiency. So how do we reduce the carbon footprint of a given unit of sales? How do we do that? And we start turning it into what are the absolute impacts of supply chain activities? And there we need to start using a different language. We need to start talking of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, for example, which is not something we typically talk about in our research at the moment. And if we are going to start talking in that language, then we really need to start changing towards objective measures and adopting that as a standard practice, which, as I say, requires something of a paradigm shift. But one of the big opportunities here, really, in becoming more ecologically literate, is that it's a really exciting opportunity to start working with some different data sets. And one of the things I will take from these webinars is in that first webinar, where we started to see some of that satellite data, some of that geographic data being mapped onto supply chains, and starting to see how climate change might affect the operation of supply chains. And this is a really exciting opportunity for us all to engage in this kind of research with these very new and exciting data sets. So what might this look like then? Well, we've got data sets that are being produced by civil society organizations all of the time, but we're not using or largely ignoring. So for example, the Carbon Disclosure Project, excuse me, they collect disclosures from big companies in the area of climate, water and forests. And this gives us access to potentially objective data in those areas. And it might be the case that we use that as the main data set for our research, but it could also be the case that some of us at the moment are conducting surveys, we're doing interviews, and it could be the case that if these are big corporations, that they are disclosing to the Carbon Disclosure Project, and that we could complement our existing resources with this data set in order to capture the more objective impacts of these supply chains. And then, of course, the environmental crisis is not just driven by our emissions, it's also driven by other things such as land system change. And we can start to use things like satellite data to start capturing what is happening with land system changes around the world, such as deforestation. And we can see a perfect example of this on the right there, where we can see deforestation in the Amazon from 2001 to 2018. And this is where we as supply chain scholars can potentially come in, start to use this data to not just say, this is what's happening objectively, but also these are the supply chains that are contributing towards it. But in order to ask those kind of questions, it will require a paradigm shift. We also recognize that climate change is a complex problem, a wicked problem. And this is going to really require us to embrace the complexity of it and to start engaging in some multi-level scholarship. So we have to understand that it's not just an environmental problem, but it's a social problem as well. And we need to take it from the planetary boundaries level, and we need to bring it right down to the individual level. And at the individual level, in this century, climate change is going to be experienced largely in terms of reduced capabilities for social justice. So in the case of many people, diminished human rights. So it's not enough for us to just talk about planetary boundaries, as big and daunting a challenge as that poses. But we also have to start engaging with the discourses around justice as well, social and climate justice. And one of the hard questions that we have to ask ourselves is, at this moment in time, are we contributing towards those discourses on justice? And the difficult answer there is probably not. And perhaps we've even got something of an aversion to the word justice. If you think about the triple bottom line, for example, social justice is one of those triple bottom lines, but we tend to talk about it as social performance. And we've somehow got rid of justice from the triple bottom line framework. And the question there perhaps is, why have we done that? Is there something of aversion towards this discourse? And is it something that we need to correct going forward? And then, of course, there's the time paradox that Mark talked about at the start of this presentation. So we need to transform our knowledge production system in order to meet those first two challenges. and we have to do so urgently. The doomsday clock says that it's 100 seconds to midnight. And what that basically means is that our civilization is exposed to an existential crisis because of climate change. So we have to make big changes, and we have to make them quickly. So we have to figure out how exactly we're going to do that. So the first response that I'd like to talk to you about today is one that's dear to my heart, which is the method of problematization. So this is where we as scholars start to question the assumptions that underpin our preferred ways of thinking and doing research. And this is one of the hardest things for a scholar to engage in. It's very easy to problematize the work of other people, much harder to start problematizing our preferred ways of seeing the world and doing things in that world. Nevertheless, it's an emergency. We have to act urgently. And if we don't problematize the things that are presented on this slide here, if we don't problematize these aspects of our scholarship, then we're not going to rise to the challenges that we face. So I've talked about some of these already: paradigms and discourses, measures and data. I'll be talking about some of them now in the rest of the presentation, about thinking about the types of knowledge that we produce, the role of theory within our knowledge production, and methods as well. And I would also say that metaphors are very important as well. It's a key part of how we theorize and think about the world. And I'd encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to read Andreas's article in the Journal of Supply Chain Management last year, where he encourages us to think about supply chains in terms of dancing rather than managing them. And again, dancing might be a better metaphor to think about how we're going to respond to this rapidly changing world. Are we going to try and manage it and control it, or are we going to try to somehow improvise and innovate and work with this changing world around us, which is probably going to be needed going forward? So problematization is hard work, but if we're going to rise to these challenges, then we need to do it. So one of the ways that I personally engage in problematization is to look at the work of others, certainly others outside of the field of academia, and see what they're doing, and then compare my own work to their work. So if I look at a recent example of work done outside our field in the area of supply chain management, then an example that springs to mind is Greenpeace's 2020 report, which was looking at Brazilian beef supply chains. And what it showed was that three of the big companies in that area were sourcing their cattle from a protected park, the Cerro Ricardo Franco Park. And they were able to show a real ecosystem being impacted. They were able to provide pictures of what that ecosystem looks like now that it's used to farm beef. And they were able to create real pressure on those businesses, on their customers, so supermarkets in the UK, for example, and on the financial institutions that are backing them. And then an uncomfortable question for myself is, why am I not doing more work like this? And one of the difficult answers here really is that it might be that I, like perhaps many of you, I'm too worried about the contribution to theory that my work is supposed to have, and not thinking enough about the impact that it should have, given that we're in the middle of a climate emergency. And this is a difficult piece of problematization for me, because I love theory. I love reading the Journal of Supply Chain Management for the wonderful theoretical articles that are produced. And I sometimes even fantasize about giving it all up and becoming a philosopher. But given that we're in a state of emergency, is this emphasis upon theory problematic? And this goes back to something that Anne and Lucy said last week, and that is, do we want to have everything driven by theory, or do we also want to think about impact as well? Jackie, could we go back one? Thank you. Yeah, so the next one, please. Okay, so the next response, I'm pleased to say, appears to be knocking on an open door. So when there was the survey in the first webinar asking people to think about research methods that were needed in order to respond to the climate crisis, engaged scholarship in one form or another was presented as a solution, indeed was the most common research strategy proposed. So this is an open door, I think, and it's great to see that so many people see this as a way forward. But I think one thing to just say here is that engaged scholarship is more than just action research, as important as action research is. So it's really an opportunity for us to work with practitioners, whether that is supply chain professionals, whether that's people working in civil society organizations like Greenpeace, to reimagine supply chain challenges and to really question the theories that are informing supply chain practice at the moment. And many of these, of course, will be theories that we hold close to our hearts as well. But it's through engaging in this kind of scholarship that we can engage in problematization, both of theory and of practice. And of course, it's an important way, and I assume this is why it was one of the most commonly advocated research strategies in the survey. It's because it's an opportunity for us to have some impact. And of course, in an emergency, in a crisis, impact matters. But this really, again, leads us to problematize the type of knowledge that we are producing. Our theoretical knowledge, hopefully at some point, will make some kind of contribution towards practice. But this is really about having a much more direct impact upon practice, which is needed urgently, of course, in a crisis. Jackie, could you get to the next one, please? Sorry, I don't seem to be able to move the slides, sorry. And then the third response is collaboration, as Mark said at the start. So if we're going to do all of this very hard and challenging work, we're going to start theorizing at different levels. We're going to be using multiple theoretical lenses, multiple methods, different data sets. This is going to require knowledge of different fields: industrial ecology, climate science, human geography, human rights, the discourses around justice. Then for most of us who aren't a polymath, like Leonardo da Vinci there on the right, for most of us, this kind of work is going to require collaboration. And again, because this is an emergency, because we urgently need to do things differently, collaboration is also a way for us to economize on effort as well. That being said, it will be a difficult process, and that shouldn't be dismissed. But it is an opportunity, again, for us to work with other people, to see our work through their eyes, and to create that counterstance that we need to engage in problematization. And if we don't engage in problematization, it's very hard to see how we can start to do things differently. Jackie, could you change the next one, please? Thank you. So, in terms of collaboration, then, what do I really want to say about this? And I think my key message here really is that collaboration is a chance for us to go on an adventure, to take a journey but we don't know where it's going to end up. So when I first presented this slide, I had the content on the left there, And Mark advised me to cross it out because it wasn't really what I wanted to say. And it also gave the misleading impression that I know everything there is to know about collaboration as well. But why that needed to be crossed out is because I was really thinking about collaboration in terms of what we want to achieve and then going out and finding the people that will help us to achieve it. And I think what's much more interesting about collaboration for us is that we don't know how this process is going to work. We don't know what other people are doing. We don't know how they see the world. We don't know how they see us. We don't know what data sets they're using. And this is an opportunity for us to find out. So the best anecdote probably here is from my own experience of how I started to work with the Human Rights Lab that we have in Nottingham. And I went in there as a supply chain scholar. I had this idea that I would be talking to lots of lawyers. And when I got in there, I found geographers. And I was surprised that what they were talking about was deforestation. And the data set that they were using was satellite data. And I've started working with them, and it's a very exciting experience. It isn't at all how I anticipated it to be. I imagined that they would be helping me, and it's much more the other way round. And it's really led to a type of research that is more engaged, more ecologically literate, more impactful than I ever had anticipated. And I think that's the important point about collaboration. It allows us to expand our knowledge of what's possible. If you could do the next slide, please, Jackie. Thank you. So this is the final slide from me before I hand back to Mark. And really my intention with this slide was really to highlight some actions that we could all potentially take, but also to take something that can potentially seem very difficult for us, collaborating with climate activists and climate scientists and scholars from other fields, using different data sets, this paradigm shift towards using objective measures and data, this difficult work of reflecting upon what we're doing and its impacts on the climate and also its implications for climate change. All of this does seem very daunting, I think. However, what this figure is really trying to say is that all of this potentially starts with something that we can do tomorrow. And that is fire off an email to somebody from another field within our university, or perhaps outside of our university, to an activist working in this area, and we can fire off that email and we can start a conversation with them about their work, about our work, and start this process that'll lead through problematizing our work towards this paradigm shift, towards these new and exciting collaborations, which will potentially change how we do our research in the next decade. So hopefully that makes it all manageable, and I'll hand back to Mark now. Thank you.
Okay, so all right, look at it. So one of us can sort of use Zoom. So as we know at the beginning, we wanted your feedback. So while we've got a few really cool questions, but I'm sure there are other questions or comments. So I'm going to tell you what the Journal of Supply Chain Management takes away from this, what we view as our actions. And if you have other ideas, please post them in the chat and then we'll have an open discussion. So one of the things and when I say we, I mean the editors of the journal, we sat down with the feedback from the first session, the survey responses, especially the how stuff, what can we do? And we went through that list and we said, okay, what are things here that are within our purview where we believe that we have a relatively large amount of leverage and where we can do it immediately. And so some of the things that came up. So one, suggestion was that we should be inviting articles on climate change, or at least some of the articles were climate scientists. And that one was really easy for us because we were already planning to do that. So that's sorted. So we will be doing that. The second one was about dissemination. And I think this is something that's really important for the journal as a whole, that the reality of the Journal of Supply Chain Management and its audience is our audience is academics, and you can have the most beautiful managerial implications section, but odds are managers are not reading the journal on a regular basis. And our solution to that, because we do believe that the work we publish generally has important managerial implications and contributions to theory. So our solution to that has been to try not to try and write the two audiences in the same article, because we don't think that works very well. But instead, we've developed a collaboration with Supply Chain Management Review, whose audience is purely practitioners. And most of the articles that get published in the Journal of Supply Chain Management are then republished in a different form for managers in Supply Chain Management Review. And we're going to do something similar with the content from these sessions. So we've already had discussions with the Network for Business Sustainability out of Ivy School at Western Ontario, and they have a large network of sustainability practitioners. And so we will be sharing the content from these sessions with them and hopefully starting a discussion that links the supply chain management community with their community. And if there are other ideas for what that dissemination might look like, we're perfectly willing to entertain. The final thing that I'm going to share with you is a work in progress. So this is something the editors have agreed to. And Wendy's here somewhere. I saw her. I don't know if Ting Ting is or not. She may be hiding. But we have agreed to this, but I want to be really clear. We're not quite sure how to operationalize it. So if they start arguing with me, we're arguing about the operations, not the outcome. But what we've committed to do is to try and find some way to, in essence, make sure that the issues of climate change and justice and sustainability and so on are addressed in all articles, even if it's just in the limitations. And so what we're kind of envisioning at this point, and again, it's a work in process, so we're not quite sure what the operations will look like, is that last week, Anne and Lucy raised a bunch of questions that we should be able to answer as researchers. How is this research helping to address climate change? Is it good for humanity and the planet? Who gains and who loses, and so on. Our initial version of this is that if you cannot empirically address these questions, if you cannot empirically address the implications of your results for society and or the environment, then this needs to be noted as a serious limitation in your work, right? That your work is not capturing the full range of supply chain impacts. Equally, stick, then carrot, which I think means I've got it backwards. It's supposed to be carrot first. Equally, if you can address these issues empirically, you have contributions to make, not just to management and to theory, but you have contributions to make to policy and or society, and you should. And we can't imagine that researchers are going to say no to that opportunity, but we're going to be encouraging people to do it. Now, like I said, I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but that's something that we're working on. And the idea there is that we hope anyway, that provides people a reason to start thinking about these issues if they're not, but it also provides an incentive if they already are to include them. In other words, hoping to push the discussion forward faster. So that's kind of the end of our prepared bit. Like I said, we've got some cool questions in the discussion area. And if you have others, please add them or raise your hand or whatever. Robert, can I just cold call on you? Because I think it'd be better for you trying to describe what you typed to me rather than me reading it back. And I'd like to hear what Lee had to say to it.
Okay. So I guess what I was trying to describe in a message that I sent to Mark based on his Journal of Industrial Ecology article is that we could actually take care of the time paradox. We could take care of the role of academics and being action-oriented, and also look at doing all this together in a collaborative approach, which is also part of what I think we were just getting at in the previous bit of slides, but it's through trying to fundamentally change curriculum in business schools so that we actually work with, in a collaborative way, practitioners and engage students in live projects that are field-based, and use this to figure out the problems that practitioners are actually facing, working with them in what I also call something authentic inquiry, so that we go out and do this together in figuring these problems out. And then if we could fundamentally change the way business schools are doing this, we're not there to teach students, we're there to learn, all of us, practitioners, ourselves, the students also. So I try to do this in a team-based approach. We do live consulting projects on a year-round basis, and every one of them has ESG and sustainability built into the performance outcomes. And this is one way in which I can see us bridging that gap to the time paradox, the collaborative opportunity for this, and being an action-oriented approach to it.
That's really cool. Lee, did you want to add anything to that, or other people if they're teaching?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely amazing what you're doing. I'm in the process of relaunching an MSc at Nottingham, and you've just given me a whole bunch of ideas for what we should be doing in terms of that teaching. And I think this is one of the reasons that I talk about scholarship rather than research when I'm talking about this, because what I want to do is I want to expand it way beyond just the research articles or the theoretically driven articles that we're submitting to journals. It's much broader than that. And I think if we can expand our scholarship into our teaching, then I think that's one way, as you say, that we can have some kind of impact immediately, and that we can also start responding more urgently, and most likely the case, build relationships with people that are then going to go on to be the supply chain managers, executives of the future as well, which also leads to those more positive outcomes that we want, such as engaged scholarship and collaboration. So that sounds excellent, and expect to hear from me in the future to pick your brains, because that sounds really exciting.
Yeah, ironically, I typed that chat to Mark while you were then covering the exact same topics. So the alignment was perfect, and nice handoff from Mark. But would love to follow up with you and figure this out, because we've done 200 of these live projects to date. No two projects have been the same, and we can do more in the future and create a whole platform where we could ask the question, what will it take for your organization to be carbon neutral? And figure it out. We don't have to have the answer in advance, but let's figure it out, and then figure out what the performance metrics are along the way, and then roll that into real scholarship.
Yeah, and also think about the justice aspects of it as well. I think as well. Yeah, brilliant. I'm up for that, definitely. I'm sure other people are as well. You're probably going to get about 50 emails tomorrow. Thank you for that.
David, sitting patiently.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Lee. Great, a great session, and a lot of stuff I could love to comment upon. But I'd like to segue from what Robert has suggested, with a question to the editorship of the Journal of Supply Chain Management. Our program, the Master Supply Chain Management program at Schulich School of Business in Toronto, also produces these team-based projects with the students going in and doing things that have sustainability implications. We now have a research center in sustainable supply chains also in the school. And of course, we want to leverage this knowledge that we've gained by working with these companies, turning them into case studies that can be teaching, can be also research case studies, realizing those two things are different from each other. I wonder whether the Journal of Supply Chain Management or its partner would entertain publishing some of these case studies that are on emerging kind of applications to deal with the climate crisis. And similar to what, for instance, HBR still does sometimes on occasion, where they actually have a practitioner case study, and then of course comments from experts about how they deal with the problem. It's not an academic, traditional academic publication. It's actually a case study. It would, I think, reinforce the synergy between engaging with our students, this next generation, this that you mentioned, Mark, when we started this session, engaging them in projects to develop their chops as practitioners to deal with the trade-offs of sustainability with traditional business models. It would reinforce the idea of publishing, which scholars like. And of course, we'd be creating a pool of materials for classrooms and for programs like these various masters of supply chain management programs, of which, of course, Lee is trying to get started again in his facility.
You know, Robert didn't plug his book, Dave. He could
Go
have.
for it, Robert. Go for it.
He was much more polite. I mean, my short response is that those are all important, valuable activities, but I don't know why you would want to publish them in the Journal of Supply Chain Management. I mean, the Journal of Supply Chain Management realistically has a specific audience. There are places that, you know, if I'm looking for teaching cases, I don't go to the Journal of Supply Chain Management. Just like if I'm looking for really cool math models, I don't go to the Journal of Supply Chain Management. So I would think that you would be doing yourself and the knowledge a disservice by going about it that way, that you'd be much better off if the goal is to, you know, get the knowledge out there quickly, leverage it fast, that you want to use a channel that gets to a large number of people who are looking for those teaching cases who may never read the journal. So it, you know, way back in the 80s, back when you and I were starting this process, you know, we talked about factory focus, and I think that focus matters in this case. That the idea, the cases are really cool, but I don't think that the Journal of Supply Chain Management is where you would want to put them to get that leverage. That's my perception.
If I could jump in there, I mean, I know what you're saying, David, in terms of the Journal of Supply Chain Management. I over the years, I've asked Mark to do lots of things, and only this week I was asking him to do stuff as well. And I think you know, his reply always to me is that this is something that we should be doing as a community, creating these kind of outlets for this kind of work. And I think this goes back again to the point about scholarship. This is something that we need to take ownership of as a community. And I think we need to create the places for these cases and more besides, you know, more journalistic type articles, for example, industry reports, handbooks. I think we do need to create the networks that can create the outlets for that kind of work. And again, I'd be very interested in having those conversations with you, David, and with others as well.
Yeah, so I'll use the cases in class, Dave, but I don't think they should be published in JSCM.
That's good, or maybe referring some of these case studies in a journalistic form to the Supply Chain Management Review, since you already have a partnership with them. And of course, there's no reason why there can't be a JSCM case in the case clearinghouse section partnered in there too. And I think, you know, I agree with you, Mark. There's a certain point where we have to separate some of the stuff that we're doing for our research from some of the stuff that's more implied you know, more outreach.
Lisa and Anne, you had questions that are kind of related in my mind. I'm not sure they will be in your mind. Lisa, maybe you want to start. It was a pretty specific question about working with scientists and the data they use.
So thank you. I think it's a very interesting idea to work with scientists and to work with their data and to understand like the objective measures.
All right, we lost Lisa, so I'm going to fill in the ending. Are you back?
Yeah, sorry. So the issue is that I think how can we get people to understand these measures? Like, no, people really don't understand what a metric ton of CO2 is. Is that bad? What does it look like? How much so there's, establishing a baseline, I think, is a really important starting point. And I was just wondering if anyone has any ideas on where it might be a good place to do that, or how, or both.
Well, in terms of my experience, I mean, where I first encountered that term was when I started looking at the disclosures to the Carbon Disclosure Project, and one of the reasons I started looking at that data is because I was interviewing people at the time, and I was asking them for if they could quantify some of the things that they were talking about, and they said no, but look at the disclosures. But I think the point that you make is a really good one. What does that look like? What does that actually mean? And this is really the difficulty of those collaborations. And I think it is going to be difficult in the first instance, those kind of collaborations. When we ask questions like that, they'll probably be amazed when we pose those kind of questions. But of course, it's an opportunity for them to think about how they communicate as well. It's been recognized for many decades that the climate science isn't communicated well, and it isn't communicated in an engaging way, which is why a lot of people now are trying to talk about climate justice rather than the science of climate change, because that is much more meaningful to individuals. But there is no simple answer to that question, I'm afraid. I'm afraid it's going to be difficult for us. It's going to mean reading things that we don't fully understand, and for some of you, professors in this field, it's going to be hard to go back and start asking some of those questions. It's going to lead to some uneasy meetings and conversations, I would imagine, but it's also going to potentially lead to those new and exciting collaborations as well. And I think they don't necessarily expect us to be talking at their level. I'd be amazed if they did. But I do think that we can pick up the main kind of ideas that would be needed in order to start working with these metrics. If we go back to a metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, then this is the language around carbon disclosure, and it's certainly the language that businesses are increasingly using as well. So it's not just a question of understanding what this means to talk to climate scientists. It's also a question of understanding it to be able to talk to people in businesses and some of their stakeholders as well. So it's not going to be easy. I think that's a great question that you asked, and in answering it, it's going to require us to engage in learning from scratch, really, which for people who've been leading this field for decades, it's going to be hard, but nevertheless has to be done.
And I think we sometimes forget this is a two-way street. We don't speak their language, they don't speak ours. So when that industrial ecologist says that I want to start studying supply chains, they don't know, right? They're as lost in a supply chain world as we might be in theirs. And I think, if you go into the collaboration with that perspective, and everybody knows it, right? We all bring certain knowledge and attributes, and we also bring certain knowledge gaps, and we're looking to learn from each other. That works. I think the problem, you get in trouble where one group assumes they know everything and they just have to teach the other. And often it seems like it's us who needs to be taught.
Can I just say, I just got a private message, which I assume I'm allowed to share from Robert, but he made an excellent point, which allows us to sort of link the two fields, perhaps. But he said, no matter what this metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent looks like, once you put a price on it, then it becomes meaningful to everybody. And I think that's a really excellent point, actually, and it's the answer I wish I'd given, although I think there are merits in my answer. but it's true, and then it automatically turns it into something that we can understand. And of course, companies put internal prices on those metric tons all of the time, and of course, prices are put on it for the purposes of taxation and carbon trading as well. So an excellent point around price, the universal language. Thank you, Robert.
Valentina, you just sent me something really cool. I don't know if you want to share or you want me to do it.
I can, if you want.
Please.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Lee. Thanks
Hi.
for your both presentations, and thanks to the previous guests, the last sessions. I would like to have your feedbacks, actually, because I'm co-organizing next week in my business school in Paris, a very controversial event. We are inviting all the candidates to the French presidential elections to expose the place they give to circular economy in their program. I run a chair on circular economy, and so I thought, okay, this is part of my engaged scholarship positioning, and I decided to co-organize this with a network of apartisan, so not politically committed, but entrepreneurs, industrial experts, think tank members, and so on. And we have more than 15,000 people, students, who are going to participate in this event. We have 600 on site, but not all my colleagues agree that it's right for me to do that. I believe it is. I believe we are political actors in the noble sense. I believe in engaged, not neutrality, but impartiality. But so means that I am engaged, I am impartial, but I want to push the values and topics in which I believe. Do you think I'm taking too many risks? Do you think I shouldn't do that? David, thanks. I can see your head is very...
I would say the only risk really is that if the far right candidate is the one that's most in favor of a circular economy.
Oh, but he's the first one who answered that he would be there. So this is a risk.
Yeah, I mean, what if they're the one that's most in favor? What do you do then? I think that's the only risk, personally. I think that's an excellent idea, and I think seeing yourself as political. I think, you know, Mark might disagree with me on this one, but I do think that what we're doing is political with a small p, but I think it is political nevertheless. And if you go back to that question of justice, for example, this is inherently a political discourse, which is perhaps why we're uncomfortable using those terms. If you look at climate justice, you know, that's not an academic discourse. That's a political discourse. It's a political global campaign, and I agree 100% that what we are doing is political with a small p, and I don't think you can be political with a small p without at some point addressing politics with a big P. So that sounds excellent. I hope it goes well.
I'll keep you posted.
Yeah,
going well or not.
Let me know if the far right guy
Thank
comes
you.
back as being the most in favor of a circular economy. I hope not.
No, I think that's part and parcel of what we're supposed to do as academics. And for those of you who've worked with me, I mean, I'm not really happy unless a few of my colleagues are pissed off. So Valentina, if you've got a few colleagues who are unpleased, you're probably doing the right thing. The last comment I have, and sorry, Anne, I left you to last because you did get most of last week, but Anne had a comment on working with scientists. You want to share that? This will be our last one.
Sure. Hi, and lovely to see lots of friendly faces, and well done, Valentina. I'm always in awe of what you're doing. This is brilliant, living the activist dream. So yes, I had a question mostly to you, Lee, I guess, because you talked about it. I just kind of, as we were reflecting on my own experience of working with the natural scientists as part of the Food Beacon. So Lee mentioned the Rights Lab in Nottingham. We also have something called the Food Beacon, which is around kind of collaborations across disciplines, looking at the future of food systems. And, you know, you kind of talked about the natural scientists as, you know, we need to kind of talk their language, we need to work with the scientist. And I see your point in terms of, like, I don't question the data, I don't question the facts. I know it's a climate crisis. I know we've exceeded lots of the boundaries already. feel sometimes though that there is a tendency to have the natural sciences solutions as being, you know, the sort of taking center stage in what the future will look like. And I feel as a social scientist that I have a responsibility to question that a little bit. I think we talked about it last week with Lucy in terms of, you know, do we really want robotic bees? Is that really the future? I mean, the Future Food Beacon at the moment is no secret. They're all focusing on lab-grown meat and alternative proteins and changing our food systems towards that. That's something I'm really vocal about, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. Sorry, it's quite a lengthy point.
That's a great question, I think. There's a couple of problems, I think, but really, in the first instance, if we're speaking the same language as them, so we're talking about, you know, parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're talking about metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. If we're talking that language, then it doesn't mean that we buy into everything that they're saying. So, for example, if you look at some of the people that work on the planetary boundaries framework, you know, we can buy into that framework and see its usefulness. But when they start talking about some of the solutions, it becomes a little bit nightmarish. So when they start talking about a future in which we potentially have man-made control over the climate, and we start manipulating the climate, then as social scientists, you know, the alarm bells start to ring, because one, if this is even possible, who is going to have control over the climate? Who's the people that are going to be putting aerosols into the atmosphere, who are going to be putting lead filings into the sea, etc., etc., etc.? Probably businesses, possibly in collaboration with governments, most likely in the global north. And then we get into this area of justice again. And I think that's an important point. So that second challenge around complexity is really saying, yes, the planetary boundaries framework needs to inform what we're doing. We need to have a contribution towards it. We need to be able to think at that level, and have research that contributes towards work being done in that area. But at the same time, it's not just a scientific problem. It's also a problem of climate justice. It's a problem of social justice as well. And that's perhaps where we can challenge them. And collaboration should be based on mutual problematization. It's not just us problematizing our work and punishing ourselves for all the errors that we've made in the past, but it's also a chance for them to critique some of their assumptions about the world as well. We don't want a world in which corporations in the global north or governments in the global north are able to turn up the temperature and turn down the temperature on the global climate. That's not the kind of world that most of us want to live in, and we can push back on that as well. So I don't think just speaking their language means that we're entirely subservient to them. But I do think there is a problem with these kind of collaborations potentially. So one of the natural scientists that I've read the most is E.O. Wilson, the conservationist, the biologist, you know, the person that coined the term biodiversity, recently died. And one of his books was called Consilience, and it's about collaboration between natural sciences and the social sciences. And I was really excited to read that book, and I got it. And it was basically, natural sciences are great, the social sciences have done nothing of use ever in terms of helping us avert the environmental crisis. You know, my jaw dropped, and it was like, oh right, this is how you see us. And I know from conversations that I've had with you, Anne, with some of your experiences, I know that you have felt that social sciences are very much seen as secondary and subservient to the needs of the natural scientists. And I think that's something that we have to push back on as best as we as best as we can.
I think you're right, Lee, and I take your point. I think there's also, sorry, Mark, I'm taking time, but I'm just like thinking, you know, obviously, you know, they have the ears of, you know, government. They have the policymakers do listen to the natural scientists, you know, and I think there is something to be done. I mean, how do we change the conversation? You know, you're saying we question those solutions, and you say most people don't want to live in those futures. I don't know that. I'm not sure most people know the implications of these proposed futures. So I think that's where our job is, perhaps, to kind of unpack those implications. And that probably is the same kind of type of question as Lisa was talking about, kind of translating things and engaging with the right audiences somehow. The public, the policymakers, I think that's where we need to do the work. So yeah, sorry,
absolutely. Exactly. Engaged scholarship. It's not just about working with purchasing managers, you know, logistics managers, whoever within the supply chain. It's also working with policymakers, and trying to also get our voices across as well, and also to talk in the language of climate and social justice, as well as the language of climate science as well.
So I'm going to add two things to that. And one is, while I agree that we may not always have the ear of policymakers, economists do, and they're social scientists, and they speak a language we understand. And so I do think that we sometimes forget that we do have that pathway. The other thing is, you know, if it's a collaboration, it's a two-way street. They're going to question some of what we do. We're going to question some of what they do. I think one of our primary areas of pushback is, you know, that their solutions are only useful if they're implemented, right? And our expertise is on the implementation side. And if they're unimplementable, if they do not, you know, if people aren't comfortable with them, if people don't want them, it doesn't matter if the maths work, right? That these are all, that's where these collaborations come from. Are they all going to be successful? No. I mean, we've all probably had the experience of trying to work with people in other disciplines that's gone horribly wrong, but hopefully many of you have also had the experience where it works quite well and it can be quite rewarding. I guess, you know, I'm going to thank everybody for hanging out, for staying an extra 15+ minutes. It's been a really cool conversation across the 3 sessions. I appreciate that you listened to us today. And like I said, we've shared the first session online already. We'll share the second one tomorrow, I believe, and this one then next week. And equally, we'll be disseminating in other places. So we look forward to continuing the conversation across time. But thank you very much.